Professor Tharakin, and welcome to today's segment on state building, expansion, and conflict in history. Throughout history, societies have begun, improved, and fallen. However, one of the recurring themes is state building, expansion, and conflict. Since the time of hunter-gatherers, conflict has occurred with competition between individuals over food, space, and other resources. However, with the wave of culture that was brought on by the agricultural revolution, societies have begun to formulate a state. Beginning first as city-states, groups began to evolve into nations, empires, and finally, modern-day countries. Through conflict, nations and peoples were able to expand and develop their political structure into what it is today. Some prime examples of state building, expansion, and conflict were the empires of ancient Rome, the Mongols, and Great Britain. These empires have laid the foundations for the way our political system has evolved to be, and how empires in the present expand through conquest, and use conflict as an expression of political might and personal beliefs. Although conflict has remained a primary method of expansion and state building throughout history, the methods in which the conflict is carried out has changed, along with the political systems that have been developed by this conflict.
The first major empire known for its quick expansion, brutal warfare, yet advanced political system is ancient Rome. Located in the center of the Mediterranean, Rome began as a small city-state but quickly expanded to be the vast empire we know it to be. During 600 BCE to 600 CE, Rome made its mark on history by expanding through brutal conquest to the areas of northern Africa and western and eastern Europe. Quite quickly, Rome became the dominant force in the Mediterranean. First beginning as a republic, Rome made its first victory in the Punic Wars, in which it went up against Carthage in North Africa in order to conquer Sicily, a small island south of the Roman coast. Rome remained as a republic in which the elite, known as patricians, ruled in a senate which elected two rulers known as consuls. The general public, plebeians, then elected representatives known as tribunes. When military general Julius Caesar gained power, he led his troops to conquer Western Europe all the way to Great Britain. After Caesar's great conquests, he returned to Rome and the people wanted to make him emperor. Once Caesar was crowned, the people revolted this absolute control. Similar to the political election protests in Thailand, the present time, that the anti-government protesters in Thailand are rioting to prevent Prime Minister Shinawatra from remaining in office, the Roman population wanted to prevent a Caesar from remaining in power. This ultimately failed, resulting in a civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian. Octavian's victory over Mark Antony resulted in the establishment of Rome as an empire. As an empire, the political power rested with the emperor. However, the patricians acted as advisors to the emperor and still had power over the people. Rome remained as an empire until Emperor Constantine came to power and split the empire by moving the capital to Constantinople.
The Mongols, like the Romans, were known for their brutal warfare. The height of the Mongol Empire was during 600 CE through 1450 CE. Prior to Genghis Khan's rule, the Mongols were a nomadic people living in the foothills of what is now Mongolia. However, after Genghis Khan's unification of the nomadic people, the Mongols were able to sweep through Asia, conquering everything in their path. They succeeded in expanding all the way through most of Russia. Known for their brutal warfare, the Mongols utilized archery while riding backwards on horseback. The Mongols were particularly brutal in battle. They destroyed towns and massacred thousands. Similar to the war crimes committed by the Mongols is the war crimes in the Central African Republic at the present time, in which Christians are massacring, raping, torturing, and forcing the Muslims in the country to flee. The primary fault in the Mongol empires which ultimately led to its demise, was its failed political system. Because Genghis Khan focused primarily on expanding his empire and not so much on maintaining a strong government, the empire was fairly weak, despite its strong army. Genghis Khan maintained absolute power and he displayed tolerance to those conquered. However, the primary focus of the empire was again just to conquer. In order to gain followers, Genghis Khan advertised more democratic and non-feudal political views. However, he still maintained absolute power. Because of this failed political system, after Genghis Khan's death in 1227 CE, the empire was divided into 4 separate empires: the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chaganti Khanate.
Looking at the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, who was a leader of Mongol horse clans, he united his forces into a formidable fighting force, which at the time overpowered all of its neighboring countries. It overthrew the weak Chinese state nearby, for example, which was racked by internal turmoil. Then, using its strength, marched west to conquer other territories, pressing as far as Russia and Eastern European border regions. However, Genghis Khan had few political institutions established to support his empire. One example, for instance, in northern Afghanistan, they established the city of Bagram to control trade routes through the Silk Roads, but then had to come back a few years later and destroy the city that they founded because of political uprisings and revolts. Through the lack of political infrastructure, they also weren't able to develop their own systems of government and had to assume or allow local systems already in place to remain in power. For example, in China, they just adopted the Chinese system of government and the culture. Ultimately, the Mongol Empire fell apart, broke into 4 pieces, and was lost.
The Empire of Great Britain began through the colonization of the Americas. However, once these colonies gained independence, Britain began to focus its attention, money, and energy on India, Africa, and Southeast Asia in 1750 through 1900 CE. This revival of imperialism was known as the Age of New Imperialism. The British occupation of Africa was sparked by Europe's scramble for Africa begun by the French. Development of colonies began through brutal warfare in which the British dominated the lesser advanced natives of Africa. This conflict allowed for the British to build their political system in Africa. In Africa, the British maintained both direct and indirect rule. A small percentage of Africans were allowed to keep their politics and culture. The African law remained customary, and rulers kept power and indigenous forms of rule. This didn't mean that anything changed, yet little things were altered. The British government would implement policies that took power away from local rulers. An example of this was how the British took indigenous rulers' ability to sentence anyone to death, and these cases were given to the British courts to decide. The African rulers could only rule by customary laws, but the British enforced new rules disguising them as customary laws. For example, they implemented a hut tax for anyone living in a hut. Even though this was never a customary law, it was portrayed as one by British officials. Like in Africa, the British control in India was sparked by the East India Company's desire for land for trading along the Indian coast. This desire for trading land was expressed through the conquest of some of the coastal towns. The East India Company was a sophisticated form of trade that helped the exports and imports in India. After the East India Company gained some territory in India, the British government quickly took over the political system, appointing a British Raj. The British previously developed a mercenary army composed of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. The sepoys ultimately rebelled in order to usurp the British, but were disbanded. From then on, the British held sovereign rule over the Indian subcontinent until the early 19th century. The lasting effects of imperialism can be traced through current events, both in regions previously colonized by imperialist powers, such as Southeast Asia and Africa. Made independent from their imperial colonizers, these regions are now characterized by political instability, international tensions, and underdevelopment. In areas such as North Africa, the great political instability enabled the rise of Gaddafi in Libya, which created years of political unrest and oppression, as evident by transition of Libya's state in recent years. The conflict in Libya for the past few years reflects the methods of control and rule in Britain during the imperialistic age. Like with the Empire of Great Britain, the Libyan government relies on the loyalty and support of its people in specific tribes. Britain focuses mainly on indirect rule, in which they relied on the population to remain loyal and honor their laws. Finally, similar to Libya, the British utilized the army in order to maintain power and loyalty with their subjects.
To conclude, State building, expansion, and conflict is a primary theme that is recurring throughout the history of the world. Conflict is an essential part of the human experience. People of all ages and all different eras fight for different reasons over food, land, resources, and other issues, through the slow and tedious process of conquest. However, history has made an example for us, and we have built up our civilizations above the foundations of our precursors, and have deeply influenced our political systems, cultural values, methods of warfare, and nation-building tactics. All in all, state building has remained relevant throughout history as the human race has continued to use conflict as a method of expansion and change the political systems in the world. Thank you.